Hello everyone, my name is Tanya Akomo and I will be taking you through recitation 1A of the Introduction to Deep Learning class. In this recitation, I will take you through the basics of how an MLP learns to produce the correct output. So to start us off, we all know that there are tasks that are easy for humans to do but can be difficult for machines. For example, you as a human, when you're given these three pictures, you're able to easily identify which is the dog, which is the cat, and which is the fox. However, when you give to a machine, it may not be able to give the correct output, depending on like the amount of training it has received. Likewise, there are tasks that are easy for machines to do, which are difficult for humans. And this is like in the computational realm where machines are able to handle and process large amount of information um, at a very short time compared to the human capacity. So from the previous classes that you've had, we know that an artificial neural network is modeled like the neuron in the biological brain. So as humans, our brains are made of connected neurons that are always communicating to each other, firing signals to different parts of the human system, and that is why our body is able to function as it is. So what you see here, this is the model of a single neuron in the brain, and it receives a signal, and depending on the strength of the signal, it either fires an output or no output, meaning it has a threshold at which to check the strength of the signal to determine whether it should pass the information or not pass the information. So in this case, you can see that our signal is in the red zone over here, which means it's very low. So it will not fire any signal, and thus it will not produce any output. When the signal gets to a strength that is higher than a certain threshold, then it fires an output. And this is how a single layer neural network, also known as the perceptron, is modeled after. You can see the perceptron modeled after a single neuron, and the threshold that the neuron uses to fire an output or to not fire an output is what we call the activation function. So, what are perceptrons? Perceptrons are single layer neural networks that have four parts, as you can see here. The first part is the input, which is provided from the data that is given to the network. And then here in the purple, we have the weights, which is what the network uses to learn. And then we have the weighted sum, which is a summation of the input and the weight. And then um, we have a threshold, which now the perceptron uses to either fire or produce an output or not produce an output. This threshold is what we now call an activation function, if we are to talk in terms of deep learning lingo. So there are various activation functions, such as the 0 to 1, the step function, the sigmoid function, which is a bit smoother, the tanh function, or the ReLU function. In the next coming classes, you're going to learn about these functions, but these are most of the functions that we are going to use for the class. And also note that the perceptrons are also binary linear classifiers. Like for this example, you can see that the torch is either on or off. So it only gives an output or does not give an output. So in the case where we have to differentiate between a dog and a cat, this is how the representation would look like. We'd have a binary linear classification with a single layer perceptron able to clearly separate the dogs from the cat. You give it the input and the weights. It has the activation function, and it tells you that this is either a dog or this is either a cat. But what happens when we add another class of animal, which is the fox? A single layer perceptron, being a binary linear classifier, is not able to differentiate three outputs. So how do we make it differentiate three outputs? We can add another layer of perceptron, which now differentiates between the fox and the other classes of animals. This way, we're able to get three output. We are able to differentiate between three outputs, that is the dog, the cat, and the fox. So adding another layer, another perceptron, now makes it a multi-layer perceptron, because now we no longer have one layer, one single layer of perceptron doing the classification. We have multiple layers of perceptron doing the classification of multiple classes. So this is the structure of a multi-layer perceptron. This is what we call a fully connected multi-layer perceptron, also known as an MLP. We call it fully connected because each node in this middle section here is connected to every other node before it and after it. So you can see this node is connected to this node, is connected to this node, is connected to this node. So that is what we call fully connected. We don't count the input nodes and the output nodes being connected to each other, because that it does not warrant a fully connected nodes. Only the hidden nodes here that are not part of the input and the part of the output is what connected to each other is what we now refer to as fully connected neural network. So an MLP is made up of these components. If you start from the left to the right, we have the red here. This is the input layer, followed by the yellow here. This is a single hidden layer composed of three nodes. This is the first node, second node, the third node. As you continue, all the yellows are hidden layers, and then we finally come to the blue, which is the output layer. So an MLP can have any number of hidden layers, but it always have like a single input layer and an output layer. So to walk you through, the forward signal is whereby we pass an input to the MLP, and it passes through the layers and we get an output of that. So if you can see this red, these are the inputs, and then the ones in blue, or is it purple, for those who are not colorblind, these are the weights associated with the nodes, and then the green are the threshold, the activation functions, and so the signal continues to propagate up until we get to the output. So how does this work? We first have an input, the input containing information about what a fox is, and then we have the weights associated to the nodes of the input, and then we have the weighted sum here in green. The inputs and the weights which make up the weighted sum are now then passed to the activation function, which now then gives an output. So this first hidden layer produces an output, which will become the input to the next hidden layer. So the output of the first hidden layer becomes the input to the next hidden layer, along with the weights associated with each node of that hidden layer. So this continues as you go left to right forward, whereby each hidden layer produces an output which becomes the input of the next hidden layer up until we get an output. But like with all machines, with all systems, we cannot have a machine that produces 100% correct answers. There will be an error. So, but in this case, we know the error because, for example, the the network may tell us that this is a fox, but we know that it is a dog. But how do we quantify this error? How do we compute it? We have to start then from the output node that produced the error and calculate or compute the fraction of error that this single node contributed to the error that produces this output. So this is how we start. This is with the layer that produces the output. We compute all the errors of each node. So we start with this node. We're going to, because it used the weights, all these weights, this weight, this weight, and this weight contributed to the output of this this node. Then that is what we are going to use to compute the fraction of error that the node contributed to. So we calculate the fraction of the error using this function, the weight and the weights that contributed to it, and then we move on to the second node using the weights that it used to produce the output, and then the third node using the weights that it produces the output. So now we find the error of this layer of the hidden error of this layer. Now, because we know the errors, now because we have already computed the error of this layer, we can now use that to get the error of the previous hidden layer. Because remember that the output of this hidden layer was the input to this layer, and we know the error which this layer contributed to. So how do we compute the error of the hidden layer? We can take one. We can compute the error of each weight associated to the node. And then once we compute that, we add them together and multiply with the error that we had just computed before. So this now becomes the hidden error, the summation of each weighted error and multiplied by the error that was obtained in the that we computed in the previous layer. And this is repeated for each node in this layer. And the process is then repeated to now compute the errors of the previous hidden layer, the same process up until we get to the input. Now, once we get the error, if you know the error, you know your target, and you know your actual output, you want to minimize the error so that the neural network can produce the correct output. To do this, you have to update the weights, because the weights is what the MLP uses to learn how to produce the correct output. So we have this as the actual output, and then we have this as the desired target. And you can see that the difference between that is the weights. We have to update the weights up until the point where the error is minimized to near zero. And to do this, we're going to use the gradient descent step, whereby we start from our current position, and then according to the direction of the slope of the gradient, we update the weight of the node. So, but because you're trying to minimize the error, when we get the gradient and we descend, we get the slope, we descend to a step, the weight will be updated in the opposite direction by which we descend. So we can use this error function, whereby we use the square of the difference between the desired target and the actual output, because this is going to help us to go in small steps, so that we are able to ensure that we're moving slowly up until we reach a global minima. Because you can see from this, there are a number of different low points at which we do not want the network to stop learning when it is here, because there's already a lower point which has to learn up until it reaches that point. So using this error function will help us to use small steps so that we are able to make sure that we are going in the right direction and ensure that we reach the local minima. Now, how do we update the weights? We use this formula to get the new weights, because if we calculate all the errors and get the actual error, it is going to be hard for us to update each weight according to the final value of the error. So what do? We update the weights in steps, instead of waiting to reach up to the end and then now trying to choose a set of weights that now is going to make sure that the error is limited. We do the weights we update the weights incrementally in small steps. And so this function that you see here can be applied to all the as we go backwards. It can be applied to all the layers as we go backwards. So as you can see, so this this value here, the LR, is what we call the learning rate. The learning rate is a parameter which we use now to moderate the amount of change that we are putting in the weight, so that we don't overshoot or undershoot. So the learning rate is what, if the learning rate might be too high, we might be able to overstep. And then, so for example, we are at this position, and then we have a learning rate that now pushes us from this position to this position, meaning we have missed the global minima. And then it continues up until the point where it reaches a local minima, and the network stops learning. That would be bad for our network. What we want is to be able to, now this is what I was talking about, shooting up until it reaches the local minima where it misses this step. So what we want is to be able to not stop at a local minima, but update the weight up until we get to the global minima. So that's it for this recitation. Remember, we learned about MLPs and how they are used to learn how to produce the correct output. And if you have any further questions, you can make a post on Piazza, and we will be sure to get back to you with any clarification that you may need. Thank you, and all the best.